I mean, it started for me, actually, the first bit of really interesting work we did was the advocacy work. So I got involved in supporting a particular organisation that was set up definitely as advocacy, and I think sometimes people don't understand this distinction, and I think it's the advocacy that's lost its way at the moment. In the broadest sense of the word, we get three types of support stroke peer services. And they've gone up and down, really. So, you know, the oldest one of all is just peer-to-peer service that's got nothing to do with treatment or agencies or funding. So that's AA, isn't it? So that's peers to peers providing their own service in a way. Yes. We now have modern versions, and I know on our film series we've got an interview with James, for example, that's an exclusively peer-to-peer service. So we can have modern versions of that. So and then, but very early on, we would have actually had far more advocacy-based services, and we can go all the way back in the drug and alcohol world to roles of people like Terence Higgins in the HIV and AIDS period, where people were really advocating for people to just have basic rights. So this was service users and ex-service users acting on the behalf of the others to get the basic stuff. And that's advocacy. Of course, neither of these two things represent the large part of what goes on today. The largest part of what goes on today is people with lived experience stroke peers actually being employed by drug and alcohol agencies. So they neither have the independence from that agency, nor are they challenging that agency, and they can't do it because it's their jobs. Yes. And we call that all sorts of things. We call that peer mentoring. We call it lived, you know, they've got so many different words for that, and that's where the bulk of it's gone. And it's fed into a very simple external narrative, but it's fed into an internal one as well, of course, because many people want to do that as part of their recovery, is work with others and give back. And so if this is so, just like I make a point that we need to be really clear about those three subtle differences between.
No, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very good.
Advocacy is about peers and the people that challenge the system. Peer-to-peer recovery is not controlled by the system or dependent on the system. And then a bulk of it, and again, it's very legitimate. I'm really happy to see it. And of course, Ian was doing it even in them days, is to employ people with lived experience as both volunteers and or employed staff and all the rest of it. But you can't challenge or be independent once you're taking the king's shilling, the salary, as it were. So this becomes really important. But so the first piece I got work in advocacy, and we got 2 or 3 service users, and it wasn't us that were doing it. There was I can never remember her name, but there was a lass from Oxford. I want to say she was called Rowan or something like that. It might have been Rowan. And she was training, an organised training for drug and alcohol users to be trained in the clinical Nice Orange book, to become advocates for people to go into their prescribing consultations and say, look, actually, you're not doing what you should be doing according. And we set about doing that service. And that was incredibly challenging to the system.
Oh,
they didn't, all sorts of it. They didn't like it. Yeah, we found, essentially a different set of people going and asking different people questions. You found out a lot more, for want of a simpler word, negative evaluation of what was going on in services once you kind of heard those voices. It became quite difficult, if 1 or 2 practitioners whose practice was particularly poor were then getting a lot of challenge or a lot of representation from the advocacies, or even the advocates were then going and talking to the managers and saying, look, you just notice staff members not following the guidance. This is, so that was very interesting. And then connected to that was both coming from both below and above, was the desire to start to have and I guess the broadest word for all of them was to have user forums, is what they were called in different guises. We had a Welsh user forum, but we also had local ones. And the idea that we would start to bring different people with lived experience from different agencies, in and out of agencies, and come together and just talk about and share what's going on in the system, and how that, can we start to become a voice for change. So that was one thing that went on, and that was really very interesting, really. And much of that has died away. You can't see much of that today. So, the Welsh government have had a real challenge in the last 2 or 3 years, reasserting the notion of a user forum. And that's partly because, like I say, these drug and alcohol agencies, be it statutory service or the big third sector organisations, they've all got their own in-house community through the workers and everything they employ. So they don't need they don't feel the need for external points of reference. They don't have to be challenged because they say, we've already got this stuff going on internally. Yes, which is very interesting. And then the other thing that started to happen, so we did this stuff, it was great. I worked with a lad, Peter, in Wrexham, and we had our first ever peer service user meetings in Wrexham, long time ago, and all sorts of stuff. They were really good. And then the other thing that happened, of course, was that there were bits of stuff going on across the UK, by about 2008, 2009, when you could see a discernible UK, which had the label of a recovery movement, yes? And there were national conferences, and there were national walks and stuff. And I attended many of those, extended links with people that I knew and people that I didn't know, really important people, some who, like, Rowdy, are no longer with us and stuff like that. So, and we brought some of that back to North Wales,